All right, Steve with Palladino Power Project, bringing you a video where I wanted to talk about digging deeper into the data with a 3 minute, 12-minute CP test. And before we get into the nitty gritty, I'd like to just go through an overview of CP testing and models and such. So here's the typical scenario where we're taking one or more tests or races, maximum effort tests. Now, this is important that they're maximum effort tests or race, because when we put them into a model, the model is just searching for the leverage points or using key leverage points to generate a critical power and reserve work capacity estimate. So if they're not maximal, then the estimates are going to be off. So again, this is the typical scenario where we're taking test or race data that goes into a model, which is this funnel shaped thing here for just to depict a model. And then the output typically is at least a CP estimate and a reserve work capacity estimate. There's a few exceptions which we'll get to, but input goes into the model and then there's an output. And that's where we get our CP estimate. Now, the most often used models are the linear model, which is employed in the superpower calculator, and the final surge calculator in the Palladino Power Project calculators and final surge, which are free. By the way, I'll put a link to a video tutorial on the calculators in final surge from Palladino Power Project in the description of this video. There's also a linear 1/time model, which you can find at xphizlab.com, and I'll put the link for that in the description as well. And then there are various multi-parameter models. There are the WKO and Training Peaks models, which are very similar, and the Stride and Golden Cheetah models, which are very similar. Stride essentially licensed out their model from Golden Cheetah. It's a modified version of Golden Cheetah model. So those are the most common. Most Stride users limit themselves to using only that Stride multi-parameter model. And so these are the various models that are commonly used. And just a few notes on those. One, if you have more than 2 test or race data points, you rather not use a linear model. You rather not use a superpower calculator or the final surge calculator if you have more than 2 data points. The linear 1/time model or the multi-parameter models will be better choices. For example, linear 1/time model is going to produce a more valid set of estimates using more than 2 data points than will a linear model. It's a subtlety, but just be aware, if you have more than 2 data points, use this model or the multi-parameter power duration model at your hands. So I might add that the Training Peaks model, multi-parameter model, Garmin just bought Training Peaks, so that model will be the Garmin model in the near future, I imagine. So there you have it. That's one note on this particular paradigm. The next note is that the Stride model, it does produce a reserve work capacity estimate, but it doesn't report it. So if you're using the Stride model, you don't get anything but the CP estimate out of that model. And that is an important thing as we will get to in this presentation. And the reason why, and by the way, I use reserve work capacity, RWC, reserve work capacity. That's the amount of work that can be done when running at an intensity higher than CP. So that'll determine, that amount of work will determine not only the power above CP, but also the duration for that power above CP. In the scientific literature, is typically referred to as W prime. I don't use that. I use reserve work capacity because it's a little bit more explanatory. It's the reserve amount of work that you can do above CP when you're at intensities above CP. And why is this important? Well, number one, it's a necessary element if planning in appropriate fashion for race power planning in races less than about 15 minutes for most runners. So when you're planning for races that are going to be executed at an intensity higher than CP, then you need reserve work capacity to appropriately estimate race power. So that's one. If you're looking at interval power targets and coming up with interval power targets that are in that intensity domain above CP, then really, if you have reserve work capacity, you can be more refined in establishing those power targets. So once you get over CP, you need that reserve work capacity to get more individualized power targets. And there is a calculator on Final Surge that I developed that will actually give you individualized power targets. And I'll present that later in this discussion as well. And the other thing that reserve work capacity helps with is estimating power at VO2 max and the limit of predominantly aerobic power markers. So I'll generally use 5 minutes, the 5-minute power estimate for power at VO2 max. And if you're using that as a rough guide, that power will be typically less than 2% plus or minus from your actual. And a limit of predominantly aerobic power, that is a little bit higher intensity. That's about 80, 90 seconds duration. So your 90-second power, let's say. And that gives you those markers so you can individualize your descriptive zones. One person's power VO2 max is going to be different from the next person's. And so you could, rather than just arbitrarily say it's 112% above CP or 112% of CP, you can individualize that with CP and reserve work capacity. So these are the reasons why that is important. Reserve work capacity is important. So ideally, you want to use models that are going to generate that component as you get into a little bit more elaborate use of power and duration. So back to these models, let's look at one other scenario. Let's say you don't have two or more domains represented in your database, and you just have a recent test or race, and that test or race is either less than 50 minutes or more than 50 minutes. There are calculators that allow you to get a rough estimate of CP from that race data and duration data. All right. And those calculators are, I have a couple of them in Final Surge. There is also at least the one for races longer than 50 minutes. That's in the Superpower calculator. But both of them are in Final Surge in the Palladino Power Project calculators. Again, I refer you back to the description for the video tutorials on those various calculators in Final Surge. So if you only have that one data point, you can get a rough estimate of CP, pretty good estimate actually, but it's going to have some error bands to it. But the negative or the con of this particular technique or methodology is you're not going to get a reserve work capacity estimate. You'll get a CP estimate. So I just wanted to make note of that when we're talking about this process of data point input into a model with outputs of CP and reserve work capacity. Some of them, like these two calculators, will operate on only one data point, but there's some mild limitations in terms of error bands on that CP estimate and not getting a reserve work capacity estimate. So we have a bunch of different models, and there's more than this, but these 5 are the ones I typically use in my practice, depending on what data I have to input into those models, and what I want to get out of that model as well. So I use all of them at various times in my practice of coaching athletes one-on-one, coaching runners one-on-one. I'll go into a little bit deeper here, and in terms of domains, this is what I typically recommend. I usually recommend 2 to 3 minute domain, 8 to 12 minute domain, and 20 to 40 minute domain. For this video, I changed that to 8 to 15 minutes and 20 to 50 minutes. And so you don't want to, data points that are from maximum effort tests or race that last less than 2 minutes have less leverage on the model, and probably there's some issue with possibly not depleting reserve work capacity enough. So I recommend not using data points less than 2 minutes. So 2 to 3 minute domain. Same thing on the other end. As you get longer duration, say races, longer than 50 minutes, they will leverage the model a little bit, but not as effectively as if they are in that 20 to 50 minute domain. So in other words, let's say you have a runner that runs a 10-mile race in 67 minutes. Yeah, that may leverage the model a little bit, but it's going to be less effective than a 10K that was done in say 38 minutes. And same thing as you go to half marathon, it's even lower leverage for most individuals, and marathon is virtually no leverage on a model such as a multi-parameter model or these models here. Of course, if you have a race that's longer than 50 minutes, you could drop it into one of these calculators, this calculator right here, the Final Surge calculator for races more than 50 minutes, and you'll get a reasonably good CP estimate out of that one single race, but you won't get the reserve work capacity estimate. Let's go to each model using this particular slide here. The linear model, you want to have at least a data point in the 2 to 3 minute domain and a data point that could be even up to 20 minutes for that matter. But one thing about that model, as well as the linear 1/time model, is that they don't provide good CP estimates, valid CP estimates, when the long effort is less than 12 minutes. So a 3 minute, 10 minute data set, 3 minutes and 10 minutes, are not that good. I've gone away from recommending that a long time ago. And I recommend now, if you're using the linear model or linear 1/time model, you want to have a data point of 2 to 3 minutes and a data point of at least 12 minutes. Now, I usually sit right on 12 minutes when I prescribe a CP test, because there's also tolerances. And asking someone to do a 3-minute, 15-minute, or a 3-minute and 20-minute test, which certainly works, becomes a little bit more challenging for many individuals. So 3-minute and 12-minute is sort of like my minimum and typically my typical prescription for a CP test that will be input into this model. Now, if you let's say you've tested 2 or 3 minutes on Tuesday, 8 to 15 minutes on Thursday, and then on Sunday you run a park run that's, say, 21 minutes. You could input all of those into this model, not that model, not the linear model, but the linear 1/time model. You could do that, and you could utilize the multi-parameter model. Now, the multi-parameter model needs at least this data point and at least this data point to work best. If it's only 2 to 3 minutes and only 8 to 12 minutes, let's say, it's not going to be as good an estimate of CP and reserve work capacity as if it had data points in this combination. Ideally, you want all three of these domains represented in the current 90-day database that most of these power duration models operate on. All right, so you'd rather have all three represented, because the more maximum effort testings in these domains and that 90-day period, the better, the more accurate your CP estimate will be in most cases. Now, the frequency is, I usually say 4 to 6 weeks. And the reason why 4 to 6 weeks is because there are a few considerations. One is, what's the time course for fitness changes? If we stretch it out and it gets to longer than 60 days, right? Fitness can be changed. So if you're operating on data that's more than 60 days old, that's not representative of your current fitness. So we like to keep the frequency of these tests rolling into that model at about 4 to 6 week intervals. Now, it doesn't have to be all 3 domains or even 2 domains, but you can rotate them. They don't all have to be at the same time. You could rotate them. Do this one, and then 4 weeks later do this one, 4 weeks later do this one. And sort of then you're always keeping within about that frequency, keeping the model fresh. All right? So there's a little bit of background on this general concept of inputting data into a model and getting a estimate or set of estimates out. Now, let's get into a specific, what I intended to do from the get-go is, let's look at a 3-minute, 12-minute CP testing scenario and digging as much data out of that as possible, not simply the CP estimate and reserve work capacity estimate. Now, when I'm using a 3-minute and 12-minute test, I'm usually prescribing on the same day for most athletes that I coach. And that they're done on the same day, and there needs to be at least 30 minutes between the tests. Longer is better if that's what it takes to recover between those two tests. Now, you can also do this on separate days. Do this and then this the next day, or 2 days later. Do so again. This one on a Tuesday, or let's say this one on a Tuesday, this one on a Thursday, and then Sunday you can even add that park run if you want. But I want to limit the discussion to 3-minute and 12-minute testing. So usually the same day, and that means you're using one of these two models, again, because there's only 2 test data points to use. So you're using one of these 2 models, and you're going to get a CP estimate, a reserve work capacity estimate. That's what we're looking for. Now let's dig deeper, all right? So let's start by popping the data points into the model. Now, this is an athlete that recently did a 3-minute, 12-minute CP test, and they had 410 watts for the 3-minute test, 366 watts for the 12-minute test. I'm using the final surge model in this one, which is a linear model, but produces exactly the same data points or data outputs as the linear 1/time model, right? So I'm just using that to depict that. These are the outcomes. CP 351.3, reserve work capacity 10.56 kilojoules. All right. So we're going to dig a little deeper into, we don't just get that CP estimate and the reserve work capacity estimate. We can take those data points. I would round this. I would round it to 350 watts and say 10.6 kilojoules. All right. Round it and then input it into the individualized interval power target calculator, which is also in final search. Again, the video tutorials are linked in the description of this video. And you'll get, based on those two, not just the CP, but also this individual's reserve work capacity, and you'll get power target ranges for these various types of intervals. All right, so that's one digger dive into the data besides simply getting a CP estimate. We're getting the reserve work capacity estimate. We can put both of them and get individualized interval power targets. We'll also, from that, we can estimate the 5-minute power, which is a surrogate for power of VO2 max. Again, as I said earlier, that surrogate power at VO2 max is going to be typically within 2% of what you would do if you did a graded exercise test and found what power coincided with your VO2 max. Now, if you do a graded exercise test, it's usually in the lab, it's usually on the treadmill, and if you're using Stride, there's no air power reporting, so the power at VO2 max is going to be devoid of that air power component. So it's not going to be all that useful without doing some mathematic work on getting your outdoor power VO2 max. Why is this number important? Well, this sort of is giving you a ballpark for your zone, the upper limit of your power VO2 max or max aerobic power zone. And you can also utilize this with some knowledge to interpret your power targets. So, this is 387, the power target calculator. It was giving you these power targets, which are pretty close to 387 here for this, for longer max aerobic power intervals, and for shorter ones, it's actually right in the mix. So again, remember, this is your 5-minute max power, estimated 5-minute max power. So you're not going to be running 387 watts for 5-minute intervals unless you're only doing one. But nevertheless, utilizing the CP and reserve work capacity estimates from that 312 test in the models, we're able to estimate approximately what power VO2 max is. Furthermore, we can take that 12-minute test, at least take the distance covered. We can input it into, say, a Cooper test calculator. For example, this one. I'll put the link for this calculator in the description of the video as well. We can put the distance covered during that 12-minute test into this calculator and get an approximation of VO2 max. So for this athlete, with that test that I just showed you, or those test results, and this was the distance covered in that 12-minute test, the estimated VO2 max is about 67.3 milliliters per minute per kilogram for this athlete. So there's a little bit, another deeper dive into the data. The other thing you can do, just as an aside, you can take that 12-minute test, just that data alone, input it into the final surge calculator for tests and races less than 50 minutes, and it'll give you that ballpark. Now, this athlete was 351, and the estimated range is 350 to 355 from this 12-minute test. Higher reserve work capacity individuals tend to gravitate towards this end, lower towards this end. But this can be utilized in some cases when you're really evaluating the quality of the 312 test and see if the CP estimate value is dramatically outside of this. So it gives you sort of a quality control sort of capacity with that 12-minute test. Another thing you can do from the 12-minute test, particularly if you have Garmin data, you can go to a fit file viewer, or you have WKO, which I have. You can go ahead and get the temperature and humidity data. So from that CP test that gives you the CP and reserve work capacity estimate, now you know the baseline. Now, if you can see in this test, it was done on the same day. It was a little bit cooler for the 12-minute test. Typically, temperature, humidity impact longer durations more so than shorter durations. I'll give you an example. If you're running a 400-meter race in 80 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, that's going to be far, far less impacted than if you're doing a 10K race in 80 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. So I typically, when there's a disparity, or if you're doing them on separate days, I'll typically utilize this as my baseline. I utilize the data from the 12-minute test as my baseline. So for this athlete, I rounded it's about 350 watt for the CP estimate, 10.6 kilojoules for the reserve work capacity estimate. It's specific to a range close to 31 with 21% humidity for this athlete. So that's another thing you can do as you dig deeper into this data. Now, if you have a multi-parameter model, these data points may be from any point in the last 90 days, and you don't necessarily have the exact temperature and humidity on those. So that's why I like same day 3-minute, 12-minute CP tests, or 3-minute, 12-minute CP tests that's separated by only a couple of days. Then you're getting not only the CPU estimate, reserve work capacity estimate, individualized power target interval power targets, your power at VO2 max, but you're getting the baseline conditions, environmental conditions for that set of estimates. So another bigger, deeper dive. Even another one you can take that 12-minute test, and assuming it's run on a track or flat surface, it becomes a useful sample of running effectiveness. So in this case, it's 0.922. So for this runner, if it's a 5K, it's going to be close to 0.92, maybe 0.91. We can at least utilize this sample along with some other samples in that intensity, say for 5K, and it becomes a useful example. You also should check air power. When you do these things, typically, because you're running faster and there's more air resistance, air power is usually a little bit higher, like about 1% higher than in the 3-minute test than the 12-minute test. It's never or should never be lower. Sometimes it's about the same, and you round them, they're the same. Might be 4%, and that's okay. But the 3-minute test should never be a lower air power than the longer CP test, unless there were some issues with wind and running direction relative to the wind. So again, deeper dives into the data entry, the model, and the outputs. You get deeper dives in besides just the CP and the reserve work capacity. So there you have it. A little background on testing and modeling and various outputs, and then how to take a 3-minute, 12-minute CP test, put it into a model, and get more than just your CP estimate, and what to do with it, and get a lot deeper dive into that CP test data output. Thank you for allowing me to share this with you, and we'll catch you next time. If there are questions on this, ask them in the Palladino Power Project Facebook group, where I will be posting this video as well. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.